One of the most misreported police initiatives with regards to their investigation into the crimes now known as the Jack the Ripper murders was the suggestion that bloodhounds might prove useful in attempting to hunt down the perpetrator of the atrocities. You will read in several accounts of the crimes how the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, demonstrated his inept handling of the case with several mishaps concerning the bloodhounds. They were released, so one oft-touted misrepresentation of the facts goes, and they promptly hunted down none other than Sir Charles Warren himself. He set them loose, goes another account, and they got lost in a London fog, leaving an embarrassed Warren to cable the police stations of London, asking for their return should anyone find them. Whereas it cannot be denied that these anecdotes bring a degree of levity to the case, the fact remains that neither of them is actually true, albeit both stories have found their way into Ripper mythology, where they turn up time after time in retellings of the events of 1888. It should be noted that the idea of using bloodhounds to hunt the killer did not actually come from Sir Charles Warren himself. In fact, the newspapers had been suggesting that they might prove useful since early September. One of the earliest suggestions that bloodhounds might succeed where the police were evidently failing appeared in Lloyd's weekly newspaper on Sunday the 9th of September, the day after the murder of Annie Chapman. The article pointed out that bloodhounds had been successfully used in bringing William Fish, a Blackburn barber who had murdered a 7-year-old girl by the name of Emily Holland, to justice in 1876. The article read, "A Whitechapel workman writes, 'Why do the police not employ bloodhounds to trace the murderer? He could not commit such a crime without being covered with the blood of his victim, and this would help the dogs to trace him.' Bloodhounds were used to trace out Fish the murderer some years ago with success, but that of course was before our police force was presided over by Sir Charles Warren." Following the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the 30th of September, Mr. Percy Lindley of York Hill, Loughton in Essex, wrote to the Times to point out that, "As a breeder of bloodhounds, and knowing their power, I have little doubt that, had a hound been put upon the scent of the murderer while fresh, it might have done what the police have failed in. But now, when all trace of the scent has been trodden out, it would be quite useless. Meanwhile, as no means of detection should be left untried, it would be well if a couple or so of trained bloodhounds, unless trained they are worthless, were kept for a time at one of the police headquarters, ready for immediate use in case their services should be called for. There are doubtless owners of bloodhounds willing to lend them, if any of the police, which I fear is improbable, know how to use them." Percy Lindley's letter was read by a member of staff at the Home Office, and he duly passed the suggestion to Sir Charles Warren, observing that, "I do not know whether bloodhounds could be used in the way suggested in this letter. If they could, it would be most desirable to keep one or two ready in a police station near Whitechapel, and to have persons able to use them stationed there, so that they might be available in case of another murder." Warren was sceptical that bloodhounds could be of any use in the hunt for the killer, and he questioned how dogs could be expected to track the killer without either a piece of his clothing or a sample of his blood from which to acquire his scent. Furthermore, he argued, even if they had the aforementioned items to go on, how effective would a dog's sense of smell be on streets and pavements that hundreds, sometimes thousands of people might have been walking on all night long? His reservations notwithstanding, Sir Charles Warren did agree to hold trials to test the effectiveness of the dogs, and thus the Metropolitan Police contacted Mr. Edwin Brough, a bloodhound breeder of Windale near Scarborough in Yorkshire, who duly brought two of his finest animals, Champion Barnaby and Burgo, to London. Early on the morning of October the 8th, Mr. Brough took the hounds for a trial run in Regent's Park. Although the ground was thickly coated with frost, they did their work well, successfully tracking for nearly a mile a young man who had been given a 15-minute start. They were tried again in Hyde Park that night when it was dark, and they were again successful in hunting their quarry. At 7 o'clock the next morning, Sir Charles Warren arrived in Hyde Park on horseback to witness further trials. A half-dozen runs were made, and in 2 instances Warren himself acted as the fleeing fugitive. In every instance the dogs were successful in their quest, and Sir Charles Warren left the park impressed by what he had seen. Of course, the image of Sir Charles Warren acting as the hunted man in the Bloodhound trials proved irresistible to his adversaries in the radical press, and when, on October the 19th, a report that originated with the Press Association, but which gained widespread circulation in newspapers all over the country, suggested that at least one of the trials had not gone as smoothly as those in Regent's Park and Hyde Park, the newspapers had an absolute field day at his expense. The original report informed readers that a Press Association Woolwich correspondent says that the Bloodhounds hired by Sir Charles Warren were out for practice at Tooting on Thursday and were lost. Telegrams have this afternoon been sent to all Metropolitan Police stations to the effect that, if they are seen anywhere, an intimation is to be sent immediately to Scotland Yard. The Evening Standard of that day expanded on the supposed mishap. It is very disappointing to learn that Sir Charles Warren's Bloodhounds are lost already. The incident justifies a suspicion that they have no supernatural attributes after all. Even the police did not get lost until they were put to a really bad scent, but these animals have gone astray at practice. Moreover, the discredited human is invoked to find them. Telegrams have been dispatched to all the Metropolitan Police stations, desiring that they may be sent to Scotland Yard immediately if seen anywhere. Sanguine persons may cherish a pleasing fancy that the hounds are not lost at all, that they have struck the trail of the murderer, some murderer at least, for we have a good many about just now. Let them alone, these enthusiasts will say, and they'll come home, carrying their guilty party behind them. But comparatively few of our fellow countrymen will be able to console themselves with this fond belief. They have heard a good deal lately which upset their notions of what a dog can and cannot do. That is, if they believed all they were told. But this escapade of the picked bloodhounds will restore their self-confidence. Evidently the creatures do not differ essentially from those of their sort with which we are familiar, more or less. If they cannot be trusted to stick to business when laid upon a scent carefully indicated, but go larking over the countryside, it is clearly a matter of chance what they may do under more difficult circumstances. The penny illustrated paper treated its readers to this cartoon, which was captioned, "I knew they couldn't do without us, a member of the new detective force." Inevitably, this latest setback proved manna from heaven to Warren's avowed critics on the Pall Mall Gazette, and they took up the story of the lost bloodhounds with unbridled glee. We learned this morning that the bloodhounds recently acquired by Sir Charles Warren for Scotland Yard are missing, and, like the murderer whom they have been set to catch, they are now wanted by the police. No formal warrant of arrest, we understand, has as yet been made out, but we are informed that notification has been sent to all the police stations of the disaster, and that all constables have been instructed to apprehend all vagrant bloodhounds and bid them stand in the name of Sir Charles Warren. In spite of all endeavours, the authorities are, however, still without any clue as to the whereabouts of the missing dogs. The greatest anxiety prevails, we believe, at headquarters that the arrest of the dogs should be speedily effected. Reports such as this received widespread repetition in the Victorian newspapers, helping create a public perception of Sir Charles Warren as a hapless incompetent who was out of his depth in the pursuit of the Whitechapel murderer. This image was later seized on by generations of authors on the case who were only too happy to reproduce the story verbatim, thus cementing the idea of the Metropolitan Police Commissioner as a figure of fun whose antics hindered rather than helped the hunt for Jack the Ripper. However, hilarious as the newspaper accounts of the missing bloodhounds are, the fact remains that they are simply not true. What had happened was that their owner, Mr. Bruff, had been compelled to return to Scarborough, and he had left the bloodhounds in the care of a friend of his, Mr. W. K. Taunton, of 8 Doughty Street. Shortly afterwards, Burgo was sent to Brighton, where he had been entered in a dog show. Barnaby remained in the care of Mr. Taunton, and the plan had been to reunite the two dogs once the 3-day show had finished. However, Sir Charles Warren was unable to make a decision on paying Mr. Brough for the dogs, and consequently Mr. Brough insisted that Burgo be returned to him in Scarborough once the show had ended. He also wrote to Mr. Taunton asking that he return Barnaby. Mr. Taunton, it transpired, had arranged to take Barnaby out to Hemel Hempstead to give him some practice. On that same day, a sheep was killed on Tooting Common, and the local police wired to London asking that the hounds might be sent down. Since Mr. Taunton wasn't in London, he didn't get the telegram until his return to 8 Doughty Street, by which time it was late in the evening, too late to comply with the police request. Somebody doubtless remarked that the hounds were missing, Mr. Taunton later explained to a reporter, meaning that they did not arrive from Hemel Hempstead when sent for, and this was magnified into a report that they had been lost. A few days later, Mr. Taunton received a telegram from Leman Street Police Station asking him to bring up the hounds. It was then shortly after noon, and he obligingly took Barnaby at once. On arriving at the station, he was told by Superintendent Arnold that a burglary had been committed about 5 o'clock that morning in Commercial Street, and he was to attempt to track the thief by means of the dog. The police admitted to him that, since the burglary, they had been all over the premises, and Mr. Taunton pointed out the stupidity of expecting a dog to achieve anything under such circumstances, and after a short time he took the animal home. Mr. Taunton then wrote to Mr. Brough to tell him what had happened, and Mr. Brough demanded that the dog be sent back to him at once, as the danger of its being poisoned if it became known that the police were trying to track burglars with it was very great, and since he had no guarantee against financial loss from either Sir Charles Warren or the Home Office should this happen, he was unwilling to allow the animal to be used by the police any further. And so, by early November 1888, Burgo and Barnaby's crime-fighting days were over, and both had been returned to their owners' kennels in Yorkshire. However, the belief lingered amongst some senior police officers in Whitechapel that they were under instructions that, in the event of another murder, the body was not to be approached until the Bloodhounds could be brought to the scene and put on the scent of the murderer. This was the main reason why, in the aftermath of the murder of Mary Kelly, which took place on the 9th of November 1888, there was a delay between the police arriving at 13 Miller's Court, inside which the crime had occurred, and them actually entering the room. Mr. Taunton, though, was emphatic that the Bloodhounds would have been of no use whatsoever in the hunt for the killer of Mary Kelly, and he told a journalist that, under the circumstances in which the body of Mary Jane Kelly was found, I don't think bloodhounds would be of any use. It was then broad daylight, and the streets were crowded with people. The only chance hounds would have had would be in the event of a murdered body being discovered like the others were, in the small hours of the morning, and being put on the trail before many people were about. Thus another chapter in the Jack the Ripper saga was closed, and Barnaby and Burgo returned to the sidelines to become just one more footnote in the Whitechapel murders. However, their story still crops up in books and articles about the case, where it is illustrative of the important maxim that, when it comes to history in general and the Jack the Ripper crimes in particular, you most certainly should not believe everything you read.